What the hell is that supposed to be, old-timer? Halloween came early this year. The voice cut through the morning air at Camp Pendleton's rifle range like a poorly aimed shot, full of swagger but missing its mark entirely. Staff Sergeant Derek Martinez stood with his arms crossed, his fresh chevrons catching the California sun as he stared down at the weathered man kneeling beside an ancient rifle case. The weapon that emerged from that case was indeed orange, not the tactical tan of desert operations or the matte black of modern warfare, but a deep burnt orange that seemed to glow in the morning light, like embers from a fire that had burned decades ago. Thomas Garrett's hands, mapped with scars and calluses that told stories no young Marine could read, moved with practiced precision as he assembled the rifle. Each click of metal finding its home echoed with a certainty that should have silenced the laughter rippling through the gathered Marines. But youth rarely recognizes the weight of experience when it walks among them in worn boots and a faded jacket. The rifle itself was a contradiction, its orange stock polished to a mirror shine despite its age, its barrel longer than anything the young Marines had trained with, its scope mounted with brackets that looked hand-machined rather than mass-produced. This was not a weapon from their world of standardized equipment and approved modifications. This was something else entirely, something that breathed with history and whispered of distances these men had never contemplated. "Sir, you can't bring that carnival prize onto my range," Martinez continued, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt that only comes from someone who has mistaken a few years of service for a lifetime of wisdom. The other Marines, a collection of fresh faces and newer scars, gathered closer like wolves scenting what they believed to be weakness. They saw the tremor in Garrett's left hand, the slight stoop of his shoulders, the gray threading through what little hair remained visible beneath his worn Marine Corps veteran cap. They did not see the way his right hand remained perfectly still, or how his breathing had already slowed to the rhythm of a marksman preparing for a shot that existed only in his mind's eye. They did not notice how his feet had automatically positioned themselves at exactly the angle needed for maximum stability, or how his eyes, though aged and surrounded by deep lines, had never once wavered from their assessment of the wind flags dancing 4,000 meters downrange. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the range, as Garrett continued his ritual in silence. He pulled a small tin from his jacket pocket, the metal worn smooth from decades of handling, and removed a single round. The cartridge was unlike anything in the Marines' standard ammunition crates, longer, heavier, with a boat-tail design that spoke of custom loads and mathematical precision. The brass casing bore no manufacturer's mark, only a series of hand-etched numbers that meant nothing to the watching Marines, but everything to the man who had carved them. Each number represented a life saved, a mission completed, the impossibility made real through the marriage of physics and faith that only a true marksman understands. Garrett loaded the round with the same care a pianist might place fingers on keys before a concert, knowing that this single note would have to carry the weight of an entire symphony. I said, "You can't use that here." Martinez stepped forward, his hand moving toward Garrett's shoulder with the intention of physical emphasis. The motion stopped mid-air as a voice called out from behind the group, female and carrying an authority that transcended rank. Captain Sarah Webb had been watching from the observation tower, her binoculars trained not on the old man but on the rifle itself, recognition dawning in her eyes like sunrise over a battlefield. She had seen that orange stock before, in photographs that adorned the halls of the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, in books written about impossible shots and legendary marksmen, in the dreams of every sniper who had ever wondered if the stories were true. Staff Sergeant Stand Down, her voice carried across the range with surgical precision, cutting through the mob mentality that had been building like a scalpel through infected tissue. The captain descended from the tower with purposeful strides, her eyes never leaving the orange rifle that had become the center of this unexpected drama. The younger Marines parted before her, their mockery dissolving into confusion as they watched their superior officer approach the old man with something approaching reverence. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the worn serial number on the rifle's receiver, close enough to read the name etched into the stock in letters so small they might have been whispers. Garrett T. Echo 47. Her intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence that had fallen over the range like a blanket of snow, muffling everything except the sound of recognition finally arriving at its long-delayed appointment with history. Mr. Garrett, she said, and the formality in her voice made every Marine present straighten unconsciously. I know who you are. I know what you've done. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, visible but not yet understood by those who had been so quick to mock. Garrett's eyes, pale blue like winter sky over mountains, met hers for the first time since he'd arrived at the range. In them she saw not pride or vindication, but a weariness that comes from carrying secrets that can never fully be told, from being a legend forced to walk among those who mistake obscurity for insignificance. He nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been missed, but Captain Webb caught it and understood its meaning. Proceed with caution. Some stories are better left in the classified files where they belong. This rifle, Webb continued, turning to address the gathered Marines while Garrett returned to his preparation, is designated Sunset. It's one of 5 custom weapons built for Project Longshot in 1987. The project was classified until last year, which is why you've never heard of it. The orange coloring isn't decorative. It's a specialized polymer coating that reduces heat signature and barrel harmonics at extreme ranges. This weapon has recorded confirmed kills at distances that our current equipment can barely achieve with perfect conditions and computer assistance. The man holding it has forgotten more about long-range ballistics than most of us will ever learn. The transformation in the Marines' faces was immediate and complete, mockery melting into embarrassment, embarrassment hardening into shame, shame softening into something approaching awe. Martinez's face had gone through more color changes than a sunset, finally settling on a pale shade that matched his sudden understanding of the magnitude of his error. His hand, which had been so eager to grab and direct, now hung at his side like a flag on a windless day. The other Marines had backed away, forming a respectful semicircle around Garrett, who continued his preparations as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than background noise, no more significant than the distant sound of helicopters that occasionally passed overhead. He pulled a weather meter from his pocket, a device so old it used actual mercury, and held it up to catch the wind that others had ignored, but he had been reading since the moment he arrived. The silence stretched like a taut wire as Garrett finally rose from his kneeling position, his movements fluid despite the arthritis that had been trying to claim his joints for the past decade. He shouldered the rifle with an economy of motion that spoke of muscle memory carved so deep it had become part of his skeleton. Through the scope, he found his target. Not the standard silhouettes at the 500-meter line where the Marines typically trained, not even the long-range targets at 1,000 meters that separated good shooters from excellent ones, but something far beyond, something that required faith in mathematics and physics and the immutable laws that govern a bullet's flight through air that grows thinner and wind that grows stronger with every meter traveled. 4,000 meters. The number whispered through the group like a prayer or a curse, depending on one's understanding of what it meant. At that distance, the Earth's rotation became a factor. The bullet would be in flight for nearly 6 seconds, 6 seconds during which wind could change, mirages could dance, and 1,000 variables could conspire to turn expertise into embarrassment. The Marines watched as Garrett made adjustments to his scope that seemed to go on forever. Each click of the turret representing calculations that factored in air density, temperature gradients, spin drift, and the Coriolis effect that most of them had only heard about in theoretical discussions. "That's impossible," someone whispered, but the word died in the air as Garrett's breathing changed, becoming so shallow it almost stopped entirely. His heartbeat, visible in the slight pulse at his temple, slowed to match the rhythm of something ancient and primal. the cadence of predators who understood that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. The orange rifle, which had seemed so out of place moments ago, now appeared to glow with purpose, as if it had been waiting for this moment. This chance to prove that some things transcend the modern military's obsession with uniformity and standardization. The trigger squeeze, when it came, was so smooth that several Marines missed it entirely. There was no dramatic gesture, no held breath or countdown. Garrett's finger simply curved backward in a motion that had been perfected through 10,000 repetitions, each one carving the neural pathway deeper until conscious thought became unnecessary. The rifle spoke with a voice deeper than the Marines' M40s, a sound that rolled across the range like thunder from a storm still beyond the horizon. The recoil, which should have punished the old man's shoulder, was absorbed and redirected with a technique that turned violence into dance, force into flow. Through the spotting scopes, those who knew where to look could track the bullet's trace, a faint distortion in the air like heat shimmer in reverse, arcing through the California sky in a parabola that would have made Newton weep with joy. 6 seconds stretched into eternity, each Marine counting heartbeats, holding breaths they didn't remember taking, watching the distant target that seemed impossibly small even through magnification. The wind flags along the range told a story of changing conditions, crosswinds that shifted and died, and were reborn in new directions, each one capable of pushing the bullet off course by meters at that distance. The impact, when it came, was anticlimactic to everyone except those who understood what they had just witnessed. A small puff of dust, barely visible even through the spotting scopes, marked where the bullet had found its mark. The steel target, a full-sized silhouette that represented a human torso, rang with a sound that took another 2 seconds to travel back to the firing line, a metallic note that hung in the air like the final chord of a symphony that had been 37 years in the making. Center mass, at 4,000 meters, with iron sights that had been calibrated when most of the watching Marines were still unborn, thoughts in their parents' minds. Jesus Christ. Martinez's voice was barely a whisper. All traces of his earlier arrogance evaporated like morning dew under desert sun. The profanity was not disrespect, but rather the only expression his mind could produce when confronted with the impossible made manifest. Around him, the other Marines stood frozen, their worldviews shifting like tectonic plates as they processed what they had witnessed. They had been trained on the latest equipment, schooled in modern ballistics, taught that technology and youth were the pinnacles of military might. Yet here stood a man old enough to be their grandfather, with a rifle that belonged in a museum, demonstrating that skill transcended equipment, and that experience could not be downloaded or fast-tracked through abbreviated training programs. Captain Webb was already on her radio, her voice urgent but controlled as she spoke to someone at headquarters. The words Echo 47 and Project Longshot peppered her conversation, along with coordinates and a request for immediate transportation. Within minutes, the distant sound of rotor blades announced the arrival of a helicopter that had not been scheduled, a black UH-60 that touched down on the range with a precision that suggested its pilot was accustomed to inserting into places where precision meant the difference between success and catastrophe. From it emerged a figure whose presence changed the very air around the range, transforming it from a training ground into something closer to hallowed ground. General Marcus Stone moved with the purposeful stride of a man who had spent his entire life moving toward objectives that others deemed impossible. His chest bore ribbons that told stories of Iraq, Afghanistan, and a dozen other places where America's interests had required protection by men willing to trade their youth for their country's security. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, eyes that had seen the classified files, that knew the names behind the redacted reports, that understood the true cost of the freedoms the younger Marines took for granted. He walked past Martinez without acknowledging his existence, past the young Marines who snapped to attention with a precision born of trained reflex rather than genuine respect, straight to the man with the orange rifle who had not moved from his shooting position. "Tom," the general said, and the use of the first name in front of enlisted Marines was so unprecedented that several of them forgot to breathe. I heard you were here. I heard what just happened. His hand extended not in the formal handshake of military courtesy, but in the grip of one warrior acknowledging another, a gesture that transcended rank and recognized something far more fundamental. Garrett took the hand, his own grip still steady despite the age that had marked every other part of his body, and for a moment the two men stood there, connected by shared understanding of sacrifices that could never be fully explained to those who had not made them. "Sir," Garrett's voice when he finally spoke was like gravel polished smooth by years of silence. "I was just checking if the old girl still had it in her." The understatement was so profound that several Marines actually laughed, nervous chuckles that died quickly when they realized neither the general nor Garrett had smiled. This was not modesty, but simply fact. A man checking if his skills had survived the decades, the way another might test an old car to see if it still started. The orange rifle, still warm from its single shot, seemed to pulse with life in his hands, a reminder that some partnerships transcend the normal boundaries of man and machine. "Mr. Garrett," the general's voice carried across the range with the force of command even though he was speaking to a civilian, "would you honor us with a demonstration? The full sequence if you're willing." These Marines need to understand what marksmanship really means, what it meant to men like you, who held lines that couldn't be held, who took shots that couldn't be made, who carried our flag into places where mathematics said survival was impossible. The request hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, sacred and heavy with meaning that transcended the simple words used to convey it. Garrett looked at the general, then at the young Marines who had mocked him, then at the orange rifle that had been his partner through landscapes of violence and valor that existed now only in classified reports and the nightmares of those who had survived them. His nod was almost imperceptible, but Captain Webb saw it and immediately began issuing orders. Targets were placed at intervals that defied standard training protocols: 500 meters, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000, 3,500, and finally 4,000. Each one a greater challenge than the last, each one requiring adjustments that would tax even computer-assisted modern systems. What followed was not simply a demonstration of marksmanship, but a master class in the art of the impossible. Garrett loaded 5 rounds, each one pulled from the tin with the same reverence a priest might show for sacramental wine. The young Marines watched as he engaged each target in sequence, not from nearest to farthest as logic would dictate, but in a pattern that only he understood, factoring in wind changes in the barrel's harmonics and the subtle cooling that occurred between shots. The orange rifle sang its deep song 5 times, and 5 times steel rang out across the California desert, each impact exactly where Garrett had called it, some center mass, others precisely placed in corners or edges to demonstrate a control that transcended mere accuracy. Between shots, he spoke for the first time about the craft, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom as he explained concepts that their training manuals had only touched upon. He talked about reading mirage not as distortion, but as information, about feeling the Earth's rotation in your bones, about the moment when you stop fighting the rifle and start dancing with it instead. He told them about the orange coating, how it had been developed by a scientist who had been trying to create something entirely different, but had stumbled upon a polymer that could dampen vibrations at a molecular level. He spoke of nights in places that didn't officially exist, waiting for targets that couldn't officially be engaged, taking shots that would never officially be recorded. The final shot was different. Garrett loaded a round but didn't immediately take position. Instead, he turned to Martinez, the staff sergeant, who had been so dismissive, so certain of his superiority. "You called this a carnival prize," Garrett said, his voice carrying no anger, only a sadness that came from seeing the same mistakes repeated by each new generation. "You saw age and assumed weakness. You saw difference and assumed inferiority. The enemy makes those same assumptions about you, about America, about our ability to reach out across impossible distances and touch those who would do us harm. This rifle, this carnival prize, has saved more American lives than you can imagine, has prevented attacks you'll never know about, has been the period at the end of sentences that needed to be final. He shouldered the rifle one last time, but now he was talking Martinez through the shot, explaining the mathematics of it, the faith required to trust in calculations when every instinct screamed that the target was too far, the variables too many, the margin for error non-existent. At 4,000 meters, he said, you're not shooting at where the target is. You're shooting at where it will be when the bullet finally arrives. You're placing faith in physics, in your ability to read the world as it is rather than as you wish it were. You're accepting that control is an illusion, and that the best you can do is influence probability in your favor. The final shot, when it came, was perfect in a way that transcended mere mechanical precision. The bullet flew through air that Garrett had read like scripture, following a path that he had visualized before the rifle had even touched his shoulder. The impact came exactly where he had called it. Not center mass this time, but the exact geometric center of the target's head. A shot that at that distance required not just skill, but something approaching prescience. The sound of impact rolled back across the range like applause from the universe itself, acknowledging that some men had found ways to bend reality to their will through nothing more than understanding and practice and the willingness to believe in the impossible. General Stone walked to where the Marines stood in stunned silence, their world fundamentally altered by what they had witnessed. Mr. Garrett holds the confirmed distance record for an unassisted shot, 4,247 meters, achieved in 1991 in a place that doesn't exist against a target that was never there. The orange rifle you mocked has been carried in 7 countries that we've never officially operated in. It has been wielded by 4 men, 3 of whom are dead, killed not by enemy action but by time and the weight of carrying secrets that couldn't be shared. You thought you were mocking an old man with an unusual rifle. You were actually mocking a legend who chose to remain invisible so that you could sleep safely in your beds. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of wind through the range flags and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Martinez stepped forward, his movement hesitant, his usual swagger completely absent. When he spoke, his voice cracked like a teenager's, betraying the emotional turmoil within. Sir, I don't know what to say. I dishonored myself, the Corps, and you. There's no excuse for my behavior. The apology hung in the air, sincere but somehow insufficient for the magnitude of the transgression, like trying to fill an ocean with a cup. Garrett looked at the young staff sergeant for a long moment, seeing not just the man before him, but all the young warriors he had known over the decades, each one certain of their immortality and superiority, until reality introduced itself with violent suddenness. You don't owe me an apology, son, he said finally. You owe it to yourself, to your Marines, and to the idea that every person who walks onto this range might be carrying knowledge that could save your life one day. Arrogance is a luxury that warriors can't afford. The enemy doesn't care about your rank or your youth or your modern equipment. The enemy only cares about whether you can make the shot when everything depends on it. He began disassembling the orange rifle with the same methodical precision he had shown in assembling it, each piece returning to its place in the case like a soldier returning to formation after a mission. The watching Marines saw how his hands trembled slightly when the adrenaline finally faded, how age reasserted itself once the demonstration was complete. They understood then that what they had witnessed was not just skill but will, not just ability, but the determination to maintain that ability despite decades of accumulated wounds and weariness. The orange rifle disappeared into its case, the latches closing with sounds like periods at the end of sentences, final and definitive. There's something else, General Stone said, his voice cutting through the contemplative silence. Mr. Garrett has agreed to spend the next week here, teaching what can be taught, sharing what can be shared. Not the classified techniques or the specific missions, but the mindset, the approach, the understanding that marksmanship is more art than science, more meditation than mechanics. You've been given an opportunity that money cannot buy and rank cannot command. You've been given the chance to learn from someone who has been to the edge of what's possible and returned to tell about it. The week that followed transformed not just the Marines' understanding of marksmanship, but their entire approach to their craft. Garrett taught them to read wind in the movement of grass 3,000 meters away, to feel barometric pressure changes in their sinuses, to understand that the rifle was not a tool, but a partner in a dance that required perfect synchronization. He showed them how to hand-load ammunition for specific atmospheric conditions, how to true a scope using mathematical principles developed before computers existed, how to control their heartbeat through breathing techniques stolen from ancient meditation practices and refined in crucibles of violence. Martinez became his most devoted student, arriving early and staying late, absorbing every word and motion like a sponge absorbing water after a long drought. The transformation was remarkable, from arrogant dismissal to humble acceptance to passionate pursuit of excellence. He learned that the orange color of Garrett's rifle had saved the old sniper's life once, the bright hue visible to a rescue helicopter through dense jungle canopy, when every other piece of equipment had been shed during a 3-day escape and evasion. He learned that each scratch on the rifle's surface corresponded to a mission, a memory, a moment when the impossible had been required and delivered. On the final day, Garrett gave each Marine a single hand-loaded round, the brass polished to mirror brightness, the bullet seated with microscopic precision. "This isn't for shooting," he told them. "This is for remembering. Remembering that excellence isn't about equipment or youth or natural talent. Excellence is about dedication carried through decades, about maintaining standards when no one is watching, about being ready for the moment when everyone is counting on you to do something that can't be done." Each Marine took their round with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, understanding that they held not just ammunition, but a physical reminder of what they had witnessed and learned. As the black helicopter returned to take Garrett away, the entire range turned out to see him off. They stood in formation, Marines who had witnessed something that would become legend, who would tell stories that would be disbelieved until someone produced photos of the orange rifle and the impossible groupings at impossible distances. Martinez was the last to shake his hand, the grip firm and lasting, conveying without words the transformation that had occurred. "Thank you," he said simply. But in those 2 words was an encyclopedia of meaning, an acknowledgement that mockery had become respect, that ignorance had become understanding, that a young Marine had been shown what it truly meant to be a warrior. Garrett nodded and turned toward the helicopter, but before boarding he looked back at the assembled Marines one last time. "That rifle," he said, having to raise his voice over the rotor noise, "doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the Corps, to America, to the idea that somewhere out there is always someone willing to do the impossible when it needs doing. One day, one of you might be asked to carry it or something like it. When that day comes, remember not the orange color or the long barrel or the impossible shots. Remember that excellence is a choice made every day, in every action, whether anyone is watching or not." The helicopter lifted off, carrying Thomas Garrett and his orange rifle back into the obscurity from which they had briefly emerged. But the impact of that week rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Marines who had been there told others, who told others, who told others. The story grew and spread, sometimes embellished, but always carrying the core truth, that on a range in California, an old man with an orange rifle had demonstrated that legends walk among us, disguised as ordinary people, waiting for the moment when their extraordinary skills are needed once again. Years later, when Martinez had become a master sergeant and was training his own young Marines, he would tell them about the orange rifle and the man who wielded it. He would tell them about the danger of assumptions, the poison of arrogance, the value of humility. And sometimes, when the light was right and the wind was reading just so, he would take out the polished round that Garrett had given him, holding it up so it caught the sun like a small golden promise, and he would remember the day he learned what marksmanship really meant. The round had never been fired, and never would be. It was perfect in its potential, a reminder that somewhere out there, carried by someone who might look ordinary or old or out of place, was excellence waiting to reveal itself when the moment demanded the impossible. The orange rifle still exists, somewhere in an armory that doesn't appear on any official inventory, waiting for the next person worthy of carrying it. And sometimes, on ranges across the country, when an unlikely shooter makes an impossible shot, someone will invariably ask if they've heard the story of the orange rifle and the 4,000-meter shot that humbled a generation of Marines and reminded them that excellence has no expiration date, that skill transcends equipment, and that legends often walk among us disguised as ordinary men, carrying extraordinary secrets in worn rifle cases and weathered hands that remember how to do the high. Impossible when everyone else has forgotten it was ever possible at all.